Is the Canon EOS R worth it in 2021? Yes and no. Well, it depends. Let's get into it. How's it going, everyone? My name is Dylan and welcome back to another video. I'm happy I have this chance to make this video because I like talking about different cameras and tech in general, so hopefully in the future I can make videos based on new cameras that come out or different tech as well. So let's get into it. Is the Canon EOS R worth it in 2021? I would say yes and no, depending on who you are. I'll tell you what I mean by this and then explain why maybe you should consider getting this camera or look towards other great cameras that are already out there. I'll say immediately, this camera might not be for you if you don't have the budget for it because it still costs around $1,800. But if you do have the budget for it, then I'll say this camera is great for anyone that considers themselves as a beginner to an intermediate videographer or photographer. Or if you're looking to add on another camera body, I think this would be a great B camera that isn't as expensive as your main camera but still has great quality coming out of it. And then I would say no, I wouldn't recommend this camera if you absolutely need the best quality out of your camera. Unless you're a photographer, then I still think this is a great camera to go for. This camera, even in 2021, I think is a great tool to use, as camera bodies and lenses are just tools to help you tell your story, and I think this camera has enough quality that anyone could use. You don't need like the absolute craziest setups to tell great stories. As long as the content is really good, that's all that matters. Yes, a brand new Sony a7S III would be incredible to have, but this camera is still enough to tell my story. I want to start out by sharing my experience with the EOS R. This is my first camera I've ever bought for myself, my first mirrorless camera, and it's almost been a year since I've had it now. March 7th of last year to be exact is when I got this camera. Out of everything you've seen on this channel, I'd say about 90% of it has been with the EOS R, and then the rest would be with the GoPro Hero 8 that I also have as a B camera for myself. I think you can obviously tell which is which because I don't heavily color grade my GoPro footage, but with the EOS R I really try to get better every time. After a year, I'm definitely glad that I chose this camera. It's not perfect in any way, but at the time I think it was definitely a great choice. And yeah, there are definitely much better upgrades that I could choose, but I don't have that money right now, and I think it's still an incredible camera to use. It's not perfect in any way, and I'll explain to you why I think so. It really depends what you need from a camera, so I'll start by telling you all the good things I found from using the EOS R. So to start out, I think this is a great camera to learn from if you're a beginner to intermediate. I didn't know anything to do with, shooting in manual or anything with videography or taking pictures, or any of that stuff. So I think using this as a basis for learning those tools, I think was really good. This camera doesn't give you all the other luxuries I've seen other cameras give you, but I think it's a good basics for when you're starting out, and I don't think you need any more than what this camera gives. So to start out, I don't think anyone absolutely needs 120 frames per second. I mean, you still have it in this camera at 720p, but there's no autofocus on it, so I don't really use it. But I think 1080 at 60 frames is still good enough, and that's pretty much what anyone would really need. If you absolutely need 120 frames, then yeah, don't go for this camera. It's not made for that at all. But I think 60 frames is good enough for anyone, and the 1080 quality is really good. Also on the photography side, you get to start out with 30 megapixels, which is definitely more than enough, especially if most of what you're posting is for Instagram, which you should check out if you haven't yet. And 30 megapixels is definitely enough, so even if you have to crop in, you still have a great image. Here are some of my favorite pictures that I've taken with this camera over the past year. Also, the battery life on this camera is really incredible. If you look back at those snowstorm photography videos I made, I went through those entire days with just one battery. I have an extra one, but I barely needed to use it in a single day. That, this camera really shows that it can last a long time with just one battery. Another great feature that I like about this camera, and I'm sure other cameras have this too, but the customizable buttons on the body really allows it so that you can make this camera any way you like and really make it yours. Also, one of the main reasons I chose this camera was because it had a flip LCD screen. I think it's mandatory for all mirrorless cameras to have this, and this touchscreen on the EOS R is really good, and you can easily go through all your pictures or scrub through footage footage so fast with it. It's definitely a necessity for all other cameras to have. Not only that, but to hold this camera, the grip is really good, and I think it's one of the best feeling camera bodies out there. Also, the menu system in this camera is very straightforward and easy to use. I don't think you can ever get confused with how simple this menu system is. I always hear complaints about how Sony has to update their menus, and I heard that they have, but it's still not as simple as how Canon has made theirs. Also, the color science in this camera is really good. I mean, coming straight out of the camera, you get great skin tones and everything looks really natural, and you get to shoot in C-Log. I'm pretty sure this was one of the first Canon cameras that got to use C-Log in a mirrorless body, so I think having that benefit and with the great color science combined, it turned out really good. I think there are a lot of good things about this camera, but then there are some like mixed good and bad that I want to mention real quick. So first off, you can shoot in 4K, but it does have, I think, a pretty big crop. I think around 1.6 or 1.7 times. The crop is about 1.6 times compared to full frame, and you can see this as a good thing if you have like a limited choice of lens that you can use. So like I have this 15-35 on the camera, but with this crop in 4K, it can go from like a 24 to almost a 60mm. But it could be seen as a bad thing because you don't have true 4K at 15mm. You know, it's really hard to find that balance of whether you would want that crop. But I think in the future, I wouldn't want that crop. You know, it would be really good to have, you know, the full frame in 4K. But at least for now, for learning, I get a wider choice in lenses. You know, working with around 60mm is great just with this one lens alone, so I think it outweighs the cons. Another thing that I find that's a good thing and a bad thing is that there's no IBIS in here. There's no in-body image stabilization. I think for beginners this can be considered as a good thing because it really helps you improve your handheld shots. So if you don't have any IBIS, you really have to pay attention to how you shoot so you can get really steady footage right out of the camera. But it could be a bad thing because if there's certain scenarios where there's nothing you can do about how you're moving and you want steady footage, then you know that IBIS could probably come in handy. But if you have that chance to put this camera on a gimbal or a Steadicam, then you really don't need the IBIS, so it really doesn't matter that much. It would be great to have, but it's not something that's like a necessity for me right now. Also, there is digital IS in this camera. Even though there's a tiny crop to it, I think you can get a great steady shot with it. But in 4K, getting an even more crop, it kind of doesn't seem like to benefit you that much unless you really want to zoom in to where you're shooting. Another mixed thing that you have to think about is if you want to get this camera, but you're not going to get any RF glass to shoot with it, then you're definitely going to need to get an adapter so you can put other lenses on this camera. So you know that's like an extra 100 or 200 depending on what adapter you get. So if you don't want to put that money into it, then you know it's worth considering as well. Also, one more thing that I find that's like a mix of good and bad is that there's only one card slot within this camera. I mean, right now I don't need to have dual card slots. In the future, I think, you know, I definitely will, and it would be nice to have. But right now, for learning and going throughout my first year, I never found that I needed to get another, you know, SD card slot within this camera. I've had really good SD cards and nothing bad has happened to them. I haven't lost anything yet, knock on wood. And honestly, I don't think I'm gonna need it really soon. So I think working with this camera and only having one SD card slot isn't that bad for me. But that is something that's really worth considering depending on what you do. Now coming up, these are the things that I don't like about this camera at all, and I wish, you know, it was included or I wish it was better at. I'm telling you, I would love an upgrade, but with this camera right now, I am fine with how it is, but these are the things I don't like about it. So starting out, you cannot compare this camera to any of the Sony camera's low light capabilities. I mean, I wouldn't go using this camera past like 10,000 ISO. It could shoot above that, but at that point, I don't think the footage really looks that good to begin with. And I've been learning throughout this past year that it's better to have a camera that can shoot, you know, in low light, or if you don't have like, you know, great lighting setup. I'm just getting started with the lighting setup and I'm still not there where I want to be yet. And honestly, I think if I had, you know, the Sony camera, it would probably all of this probably would have looked a lot better. Maybe, I mean, it probably won't make a difference because you still need to light your scene the way it should be lit. It's really important to learn how to properly light up your scene, but if you don't have money to go buy an expensive lights, even I don't have the most expensive, and you can see like if I turned off this light that I have next to me, the background wouldn't look that good. but you know, for certain things I don't want to have the background, you know, lit up, and I wish like this camera did better with like the grain and the noise, but I decided to like, you know, light up the back so then the pictures look better in frame. One thing I don't like about this camera that's on the body is the touch bar in the back. I don't really see, you know, like what's the point of it. Like it's just a different way of like using the same buttons that we already have. Like I use that for white balance, but I tend to not really use that much as I can just adjust it on screen. I have the shutter speed and aperture and ISO controlled on all different buttons, and that touch bar seems to like get in the way sometimes. Sometimes when I'm taking pictures or recording, I accidentally hit the touch bar and it seems to, you know, get in the way and settings change, and I don't think that's really useful. I know I can lock it, but I don't want to have to like constantly be worrying about that. So I don't know, I think it's a good thing that they decided not to go that route with the R5 and they just took it out and changed it. But that's one thing I wish they just didn't do with this camera body. But it's not like the end of the world. Another thing that's kind of lacking in this camera is the time-lapse features in here. There is a time-lapse feature in this camera, but it doesn't really look that good, and you wish like you could just use the full capabilities of just taking a bunch of pictures and then stitching them together. I wouldn't really want to use this time-lapse feature in this camera, because if I was just going to do that, then I could just, you know, record a bunch of footage and then speed it up in post, and I think that even looks better sometimes. And you really don't have the full control like you do if you just took a bunch of pictures, so instead you'd have to use like an intervalometer like I got or something so you can take better time lapses. Also, one more thing that I wish was in this camera but isn't was an interval timer shooting capability. So what I mean by this is I wish you can set like a set amount of time and then the camera can take a set number of pictures for you so you don't have to touch the camera. Especially for me who likes to shoot like self-portraits, and it gets tiring just taking one picture at a time or having to rely on my phone to take the picture. But if I want to use my full body, it's annoying having to run back and forth to just take one picture at a time. I like how in the Sonys, you know, or other cameras, you have that capability where you can take multiple pictures at once. So if there's one good picture within that burst, you know, that's pretty much all I need, while this I have to keep going running back and forth, and it just takes so much more time than if I had like a burst option. I'm pretty sure in the R5 they did add that feature, but I think it should have been included with this, as I think this was like a mix of a photography camera and a video camera, so I think it should have been in here to begin with. And that's pretty much everything about this camera. I am still really happy I went with this choice. I have a lot to consider in the future about when I decide to upgrade and like what camera brand I'm going to look towards. I'm not too sure if I'm going to stick with Canon. I'm not really too loyal with any camera brands, I would say. I just got to find what works for me and what I need. And you know, it kind of seemed like in this video I'm really looking towards the Sony cameras. I would love one of those, but I'm still really happy I chose this camera at that time. If you have any questions about this camera, leave them down below and I'll definitely answer them. And that's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you're new to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one. After a year, I'm definitely got... Oh my god.